My name's Tom Wetzel, and I'm 79, and I live in Hayward. And I was born in Los Angeles, and I grew up in the Hollywood neighborhood. My mother was a single parent, and we lived with my grandmother. My grandmother was a milliner, worked in hat making factory. She was also a Unitarian, and she was very anti-racist, and used to tell me that I had to regard all human beings as my brothers and sisters. So that sort of ingrained to me when I was a child, and it proved to be very useful actually in organizing situations to be very accepting of human diversity, which was what my grandmother and mother sort of impressed on me when I was young. After graduating from Hollywood High School, I was in community college, and then I transferred to UCLA and eventually got a PhD in philosophy, studying ontology there. And my first job was when I was 12. I was the resident paper boy at Paramount Studios. I used to sell a paper to Alfred Hitchcock every day, and he's in the late 50s when he was making Vertigo, I think. And so at community, I went to LA City College, and then to UCLA, and I was in that. Even when I graduated from high school, I worked for about 6 years in a blue collar job. I was working in these gas station lube bays doing oil changes and all that kind of thing. And that's kind of where I became first aware of like the subordinate, oppressed condition of workers, and that's when I began to think about like, well, how can the working class escape this? I participated in the Wildcat job action about 1970 when 50 of us got fired. And then I worked as a teaching assistant at UCLA for about 4 years. Then I went to Milwaukee, and I was teaching there for about 6 years at the University of Wisconsin at Milwaukee, teaching philosophy. But I decided the academic world wasn't for me. I went back to California, worked trying to find some other job. I worked 5 years as a typesetter in newspaper production, trying to organize a union. Then I worked for about 20 years as a technical writer in the computer manufacturing industry. Yeah, I went through a couple of organizing attempts that we did, kind of like what the Tech Workers Coalition is doing nowadays. And eventually I retired from Adobe Systems in 2007, but I've still been doing writing since I retired. I've been for years the managing editor of Worker Solidarity, which is a Green Syndicate's webzine, writing essays. I wrote a book, Overcoming Capitalism. It's kind of my retirement projects. Well, I started out actually as a conservative. I was a member of the Young Republicans at the community college. But like I say, I was thinking in my mind about, well, how can the working class escape its oppressed condition? And eventually that led me to guild socialism. I think around 1970 or so, I read Bertrand Russell's little book, Roads to Freedom. It's kind of an objective discussion of pros and cons of the various socialist tendencies: Marxism, Watkins anarchism, syndicalism, guild socialism. So I was persuaded of guild socialism precisely because of its emphasis upon workers' control of production. Worker self-management of the industries was an essential part of their solution, so to speak. But they also combined that with radically democratizing governance through basing it on neighborhood assemblies and that kind of thing. So you can see that guild socialism was a kind of libertarian socialist perspective, and that was the first libertarian socialist perspective I had. But then when about 1970, I got involved in organizing a union, teaching assistants at UCLA. It was the first student academic employees unions, independent unions, run in a very grassroots way to department assemblies, run by a shop stewards council. I was elected shop steward in my department. And kind of was a proof of concept to me of like grassroots unionism. And I had a friend, Ralph Albee, who was involved in that effort, who was an anarcho-syndicalist. And he was the person who kind of converted me to anarcho-syndicalism, pointed me to the Spanish Revolution, which I'd never heard about. And I started reading all kinds of stuff about it, like collectors in the Spanish Revolution, like Gaston Naval, Jose Parat's Anarchists in the Spanish Revolution, that kind of stuff. And I began to develop more of a critique of electoralism and the state. And that's kind of the late 70s when I sort of got converted over to syndicalism. And that's still my viewpoint, I guess. About 1970, early 70s, I joined the New American Movement. And it was initially founded as a non-Leninist revolutionary socialist organization. It had a libertarian socialist caucus, which I was a part of, but they gradually degenerated towards social democracy. And by about 1974, so I quit. And they eventually merged with Democratic Socialists of America, Democratic Social Organized Committee, to form the present Democratic Socialists of America. Late 70s, I was involved in the Anarchist Communist Federation, which lasted for only a couple of years before it fell apart due to internal political differences. And when I was in Milwaukee teaching, I got to know a bunch of anarchist workers who were working in factories, and we formed the Syndicalist Alliance. And we put out this free community newspaper called Impulse, so I was doing labor journalism. There was a lot of, in that period, in the 70s, there were a lot of like rank and file worker groups that were opposed to the bureaucracy of the unions and wanting greater militancy. So I was going around doing a lot of interviews with these rank and file workers. And then I would write articles for our free newspaper on things like the transit system, workers in the transit system, and trucking, various industries. And after the Anarchist Communist Federation fell apart, well, I had moved back to San Francisco, to California in 81, and I formed a group, created a group there, organized a group called the Workers' Emancipation. And we were a part of a network called the Syndicalist Workers Committee, which included the Libertarian Workers Group in New York, and we eventually formed Voter Solidarity Alliance in 84. And I was kind of a member of that, off and on. Sometimes I was not a member, sometimes I was. Up through about 2023 when that group finally split. At that time, we reduced to only like two groups in Philadelphia and the East Bay. Those two groups sort of had a parting of the ways. So here where I live, we created the East Bay Syndicalist Group, and that's the group I'm involved with now, which is the group that puts out Worker Solidarity, lead syndicalist webzine. Anarcho-syndicalism is a strategy, and it's basically a way to create a sort of a society of generalized self-management, which I see as the goal of social anarchism. I think social anarchism, I see it as a libertarian form of socialist politics. So the idea here is to rebuild all the social institutions of society on the basis of self-management, self-management of communities, by people who live in communities, self-management of workplaces, by people who work there. I see that as the goal of social anarchism because that's positive freedom. That's what libertarian here means in this context. It's the socialist form of libertarian politics. And so anarcho-syndicalism is a kind of strategy for how to achieve that. And as I see it, the way that works is we want to rebuild sort of militancy, worker militancy, and rebuild democratic grassroots organizations of militant struggle, not just in workplaces, but also like tenant organizations and other kinds of environmental organizations, other kinds of social movement organizations of resistance and struggle. And so the organization, the idea of anarcho-syndicalism is to build these organizations up on a broad scale and bringing together more and more into, coalescing together through mutual support, greater cohesion, and eventually forming a kind of united front, or what we would call a class front. Class front is a term that nowadays sometimes used by the CNT in Spain, and it's also used by the Black Rose Anarchist Liberation in a recent program, Turning the Tide. And that's basically the anarcho-syndicalist conception of the strategy. We build the class front because then that gives us the social power, the working class has the social power then to effectively confront and challenge the owning and managing classes for the control of society. And that would, there'd be some kind of process of workers taking over direct management of all the various industries, some process of negotiation with the general population, what they want produced, what services they want, and that kind of thing. That's how I kind of see syndicalism. Now, this idea of a process of negotiation is really kind of first developed by the Guild Socialists, but I think that even if you look at the Spanish anarcho-syndicalists of the 30s, they were working towards the worker industrial federations controlling the economy, but yet they introduced this idea of free municipalities, which would be like neighborhood assemblies and that kind of thing. So eventually there would need to be some kind of process of negotiation between these community organizations and the worker organizations. And so I sort of think of that as how I see libertarian socialism developing. This is where workers oppose and fight against the environmentally destructive activities of their employers and concerted actions. And it's actually a growing trend. And I can point to examples, like there was this long strike at the Erie Locomotive Works in Erie, Pennsylvania by the United Electrical Workers Union, where they're trying to force the employer, and they're still doing this, they're still fighting, to make green locomotives, like battery-powered switching locomotives. That's an example of green unionism. Another example was a recent victory last year at Rolls-Royce in Britain, where the workers through their union were able to force the employer. They make, jet engines, which are extremely destructive to the environment. They forced the employer to investigate how the workers use their skills and the existing equipment to make low carbon products. And, that's another example of green unionism. And there's a whole bunch of examples like this. It's an increasing trend where, like, for example, just recently, the Chicago Teachers Union, in their latest strike, was able to force the school district to agree to decarbonize the schools by putting solar panels on the schools, getting rid of the gas heating systems and that kind of thing, right? That's another example of green unionism in action. I mean, there's a growing number of these actions going on. Looking at the critique of both social democracy and Marxism-Leninism, that is to say democratic socialism, which is electoral socialism, it has this tendency for the politicians, even if they started out committed to socialism, to kind of moderating what they are for, because they want to win elections. They don't want to offend middle class opinion. So there's kind of an inherent tendency towards degeneration within electoral socialism, towards mere reform of capitalism. And if you look at Marxism-Leninism, it's got a similar kind of problem from a different direction, because Lenin was actually opposed to worker self-management of production. His focus was on development of productive forces, and that's why I think Marxism-Leninism became particularly popular within the less developed countries, because in those countries, being poor, countries less developed, less industry, less economic prospects, they tended to focus on growth of the economic system. And that's why you see with the Chinese Communist Party, it comes from that tradition. They still adhere to this obsessive concern with development of the productive forces, and they're even willing to make use of capitalism to do that. So they've evolved into a kind of capitalist political party, just like the Social Democrats. So it's a kind of similar degeneration from a different way, a more autocratic type of, one-party dictatorship kind of politics. But I think that the very fact that China, like, is a very repressed working class, and all of the Leninist parties, they've all ended up in this situation where the working class remains subordinate to a bureaucratic managerial regime, shows they are not capable actually of being a means to working class liberation. And that's fundamentally a discredit. It fundamentally discredits Marxism, Leninism. And I think that, so we see here that the electoral socialists and the Marxist Leninists have both ended up kind of degenerating into like just capitalist reform movements and have become discredited, both of them, through the historical results. And I think this makes the libertarian socialist critique much more relevant over time. It actually vindicates the critique that the anarcho-syndicalists made of those tendencies back in the early 20th century. I think it's going to be similar to the conceptions of anarcho-syndicalist militants of Emile Pouget, those of building a militant minority, that people who can do both popular education, contributing to the battle of ideas against the right-wing ideas on the one hand, and on the other hand, doing the actual organizing work in workplaces, in buildings, and heading unions, building unions, and being basically organizers within a building of the grassroots organizations. And within those organizations, I think it's very important to prevent those organizations from bureaucratically degenerating, which unions and other organizations have tended to do. So a role of the libertarian socialists or anarchist activists within those movements is to keep them, committed to the grassroots control, the democratic control of the organizations, and to prevent the concentration of a professional bureaucracy at the time. I think that's their role. That's hard to say, but I think that capitalism is failing. The present crisis of all these, right-wing regimes, and like MAGA wanting to blow up the administrative state and destroy the Pax Americana. It tells us that neoliberal capitalism is failing. It's not able to provide prospects of a better life for the working class majority. And so I think that there's going to be a role for radical activists doing the necessary work of organizing and popularizing ideas. And I think that because of the discredit of various other forms of socialist ideology, I think that social anarchism, if it can get itself together to work in a cohesive and practical way, does have a future to play in that. And they may, of course, necessarily have to work in united fronts with other socialist tendencies, cooperativists and electoral socialists even, and so forth, in the work towards transitioning society, especially with the global warming emergency. Green unionism is a very important force that needs to be built up. And so that's why I currently advocate green syndicalism. My group is advocating green syndicalism. And so I think that that's another kind of role for anarchists to play.